The studio lights of the Steve Harvey show had a way of making everything feel larger than life. They didn't just illuminate faces, they sculpted moments. They turned ordinary conversations into spectacles, laughter into echoes, applause into thunder. And yet on this night, something in the air resisted performance. The warmth of the stage was there, the familiar hum of anticipation, the soft rustle of the audience settling into their seats. But beneath it all lingered a quiet weight, the kind that doesn't belong to television, the kind that belongs to memory. Steve Harvey stood just beyond the curtain, straightening the cuffs of his suit, breathing in slowly, grounding himself the way he always did before stepping into the light. For decades, he had walked onto stages carrying joy, humor, confidence. He had built a career on timing, wit, and an almost supernatural ability to lift people's spirits. But even after all these years, he could still feel it, the subtle shift when a night was about to be different. Not bigger, not louder, deeper. The producer's voice crackled softly in his earpiece. 30 seconds, Steve. He nodded, eyes closing for a brief moment. His fingers brushed the small crucifix that rested against his chest beneath the fabric of his shirt, a habit so instinctive he hardly noticed it anymore. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't for show. It was grounding. A reminder of who he was before anyone ever knew his name, before the suits, before the cameras, before the applause. Tonight's guest was someone the audience adored, someone the internet called the last good man in Hollywood, someone whose quiet nature had made him almost mythic in an industry built on noise. Keanu Reeves. Steve had interviewed hundreds of celebrities, actors, athletes, world leaders, icons, but something about this conversation had lingered in his thoughts all day. Maybe it was the way people spoke about Keanu, not as a star, but as a presence. Or maybe it was the way his own spirit had reacted when he'd first read the guest notes that morning. Stories of generosity, of humility, of private grief carried without spectacle. The countdown began. 5. Steve lifted his head. 4. He rolled his shoulders back. 3. A small breath in. 2. A quiet prayer he didn't even form into words. 1. The theme music swelled, and Steve Harvey walked onto the stage to roaring applause, wearing his signature smile, waving to the crowd as he always did. The audience stood, clapping, cheering, energized by familiarity. The band hit their rhythm. The cameras glided into place. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. But Steve felt it instantly. This wasn't going to be a normal show. As the applause faded, Steve stepped to center stage, waiting for the room to settle. His voice, when he spoke, carried its usual warmth, but something else threaded through it now, something quieter, more intentional. Tonight, he said, scanning the faces before him, we have a guest who doesn't just entertain people, he moves them. The crowd murmured. The media calls him the kindest man in Hollywood. The internet calls him the last good guy left. But me, Steve paused, letting the moment breathe. I say he's living proof that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. The applause returned, softer this time, reverent. Please welcome Keanu Reeves. Keanu stepped onto the stage without spectacle. No dramatic gestures, no practiced charm, just a man in dark jeans, a simple black shirt, and a modest blazer walking into the light as if he were entering someone else's space. He offered a small wave, a shy smile, nodding to the audience as the applause washed over him. He didn't soak it in. He didn't perform it. He endured it kindly. When he reached Steve, they shook hands. Steve pulled him into a brief, warm hug before guiding him toward the chairs. And as they sat, something subtle happened. The energy shifted. The applause died down more quickly than usual. The audience leaned forward instead of settling back. The cameras slowed their movements. The noise of television gave way to the stillness of attention. Steve noticed it. Keanu noticed it. Neither of them named it. Steve turned toward his guest with a grin meant to ease them both. Man, I gotta tell you, every time you walk into a room, people feel like they're about to hear something that matters. Keanu let out a small, almost embarrassed laugh. That always surprises me, he said. I'm really just a guy trying to do his best. That's exactly why it hits, Steve replied gently. They began where all interviews begin. Films, projects, funny moments from sets. The audience laughed when Steve teased him about his quiet nature. Keanu smiled when Steve mentioned the viral videos, the subway seat, the surprise visits to fans, the stories of him giving up parts of his salary so crew members could be paid more fairly. But something was different about the way Keanu spoke. There was no deflection, no polish, no rehearsed humility. He didn't deny the stories, but he didn't decorate them either. "I don't see those as big things," he said at one point, hands loosely folded in his lap. "To me, they're just human things. Everybody's going through something, and sometimes the smallest kindness lands in the biggest way." Steve nodded deeply. "That right there," he said quietly, "that's wisdom." Keanu's gaze drifted briefly across the audience, as if he were seeing more than faces. "I've learned," he continued, "that we don't really know the weight people are carrying, we just see how they're standing under it." The room had grown quiet. Not the silence of boredom, the silence of recognition. Steve leaned back slightly, studying Keanu with a different kind of attention now. "You know, people often ask me this about you," he said. "How does someone who's reached that level of success stay so grounded?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down for a moment, considering the question not as a soundbite, but as a truth. "I think," he said slowly, "because I never forgot how much can be taken from you." Steve's expression softened. "I've lost people," Keanu continued. "People who were my world. I've seen how fast everything can change, and once you've felt that kind of loss, success doesn't sit the same way anymore. It doesn't lift you above anyone, it reminds you how fragile we all are." No one in the audience moved. Steve felt his own chest tighten, not with sadness, but with understanding. His hand drifted unconsciously toward the crucifix beneath his jacket. "I grew up moving around," Keanu went on. "Different countries, different homes. My father left when I was young. My sister was sick for years. I've buried dreams. I've buried love. I've buried versions of myself I thought I would always be." He paused, and still, he added quietly, "I'm here." The words didn't sound triumphant. They sounded grateful. "Every day," Keanu said, lifting his eyes again, "you make a choice. You let what you've been through make you harder, or you let it make you softer. I chose softer." Steve swallowed. He could feel the room changing. He had been on stages when emotions ran high, but this was different. This wasn't a show about feelings. This was a moment about truth. And then he noticed something else. The way Keanu's gaze had shifted. It wasn't wandering anymore. It had settled right on Steve, and more specifically, on the small crucifix at his chest, now faintly visible where his jacket had parted. Keanu didn't speak immediately, but something in his face had changed. Not curiosity, recognition. Steve noticed it too. He glanced down instinctively, then back up, a small, knowing smile forming. "You ever notice," he said gently, "how silence gets louder when something real is about to be said?" Keanu nodded. "Silence has been my companion for a long time," he replied. "And in that silence, sometimes I hear the clearest things." Steve leaned forward slightly. "You ever hear God in that silence?" For the first time since he had walked on stage, Keanu Reeves truly paused. Not for effect. For courage. He looked at Steve, really looked at him, and then he answered. "Yes." The word was simple, but it landed like thunder. "I believe in something greater," Keanu said. "I've questioned it, I've walked away from it, I've been angry at it. But even in the darkest seasons of my life, there was something there, a presence, a peace, not always comforting, not always loud, but always there." Steve's hand closed gently over the crucifix. "That's faith," he said softly. Keanu's eyes lingered on the cross now. And then, he leaned forward. His posture changed. His voice lowered. "Steve," he said, and there was something new in it now, something vulnerable, something heavy. "Can I tell you something I've never said in public before?" The room went utterly still. Steve didn't answer right away. He only nodded. And in that quiet nod, something unseen opened. Keanu took a slow breath. "There was a night," he began, "when I didn't want to be here anymore." And the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The studio didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a sanctuary dressed up in velvet and lighting rigs, like the walls had quietly stepped back to give something invisible room to breathe. Steve Harvey sat frozen, his laughter, his usual armor, now nowhere to be found. The audience had stopped being an audience the moment Keanu Reeves admitted, in a voice so calm it almost sounded like prayer, that there had been a night when he didn't want to be here anymore. Even the cameras seemed to move differently, slower, more respectful, as if the machines themselves understood that some truths were fragile and should not be rushed. Steve's hand stayed over the crucifix on his chest, not for television, not for drama, but because it was the only thing keeping his heart from spilling out of him right there on the chair. Keanu didn't look down in shame. He didn't look away like someone trying to hide. He stared at Steve the way a man stares at the one person who might understand without judging, and in that gaze there was an unspoken request. Don't turn this into a moment. Let it stay a truth. Steve nodded again, slowly, almost trembling. His voice tried to come out confident but cracked at the edges. "Take your time," he said, and the words sounded less like a host guiding an interview and more like a brother holding the door open for someone about to walk out of a dark room. Keanu exhaled, long and careful, like he'd been holding his breath for years. "I'm not saying this for pity," he began, his voice low, measured. "I'm saying it because sometimes people see my face and think they know my life. They see the movies, the awards, the headlines, and they assume the inside matches the outside. But there are parts of me that have lived in silence so long I almost forgot they were there." He paused, and the room held him. "There was a season when I was functioning, smiling in pictures, showing up on sets, answering questions, but it felt like I was watching someone else do it. Like my body was alive, but my spirit was somewhere else." Steve felt a familiar ache, because he knew that place, not from the same events, but from the same kind of emptiness that doesn't care who you are or what you've achieved. Steve had worn suits on stage while his heart was shattered backstage. He had smiled for crowds while his soul begged for quiet, and he realized, sitting there, that this wasn't just a celebrity confession. This was the truth that thousands of people carried in silence. Men, women, parents, workers, students, people who looked fine while drowning behind their eyes. He glanced at the audience and saw it in them too, the way they weren't watching as fans anymore, but as humans searching their own memories for the nights that almost won. Keanu's gaze drifted briefly toward the floor as if he were stepping back into the past. "I remember the night clearly," he said, "because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It didn't look like what people think a breaking point looks like. It was quiet, it was just me, alone, in a room that felt too big and too cold even with the lights on. I hadn't slept in days. Food had lost meaning. Time had turned into this strange fog. Hours would pass and I wouldn't even notice. I was sitting there and I realized something terrifying. I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't even feel angry. I felt empty, like everything inside me had been swept out." He swallowed, his jaw tightening for half a second, like a man holding a door shut against a storm. "And the scary part about emptiness is that it doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes you believe you're beyond help because you're beyond feeling." Steve's eyes were wet now, but he didn't wipe them. He didn't want to interrupt the truth with anything performative. He simply listened, his shoulders heavy with empathy. Keanu continued, his voice steady but thin with emotion. "I kept thinking about all the losses, and I'm not going to make this a list because pain isn't a competition. But when you lose people you love, when life shows you how quickly it can take, something changes. You start to fear hope because hope makes the fall harder. So your heart starts protecting itself by shutting down." He looked at Steve again. "That night I wasn't thinking, I want to die. It was worse than that. I was thinking, I don't know how to keep living." The audience sat in a reverence so deep it didn't feel like silence. It felt like agreement. Somewhere in the back, someone sniffled softly, but even that sounded like a prayer being said under breath. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and his voice came out in a whisper that carried across the stage anyway. "I know that place," he admitted, and the admission stunned some of the crowd because it was so raw, so unguarded. Steve Harvey, the man who made millions laugh, saying he knew the place where laughter couldn't reach. Keanu nodded gently. "That's why I'm telling you," he said. "Because I think people see you as joy, and they don't realize joy is often built on top of pain that didn't win." Keanu's hands moved slightly as he spoke, not dramatic gestures, just subtle motions like he was trying to shape something invisible into words. "I remember sitting with my phone," he said, "scrolling not because I wanted to see anything, but because motion was the only thing keeping me from sinking completely. My thumb kept moving, video after video, noise after noise, and then I saw you." Steve's eyebrows lifted. His breath caught. Keanu's eyes stayed on him. "It was an old clip," Keanu said. "Not even something recent. The lighting wasn't perfect. The camera quality wasn't fancy. But you were on stage and you weren't telling jokes. You were telling truth. You were talking about storms, about purpose, about how pain doesn't mean God left you behind." Keanu's voice softened. "And you were wearing that crucifix." Steve's fingers tightened around the cross again like his body reacted before his mind could. I don't know why I stopped scrolling, Keanu went on, but I did. I watched the clip once and something in me shifted, not healed, not fixed, but noticed. Like a small part of my soul lifted its head and said, "Wait, listen to this." So I watched again, and again. Keanu paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory. "You said, if you're still breathing, it means your story isn't over." And I don't know why, Steve, but that sentence hit me like it had been written for me. Steve's lips parted slightly. His eyes were glassy now, fully. "Man," he whispered, but the word didn't finish into a sentence. Keanu leaned forward a little as if he wanted to make sure Steve understood what he meant. "It wasn't just the sentence," he said. "It was the way you said it. You didn't sound like a motivational speaker reading lines. You sounded like someone who had been through it, someone who had sat in the dark and still decided to show up." He swallowed. "And that's what got me. Because in Hollywood, everything is polished, everything is rehearsed. Even pain can look staged. But that clip, it didn't feel like content, it felt like confession." Keanu's voice lowered even more, almost trembling now, though he fought to keep it steady. "After the third time watching it, I put my phone down, and for the first time in weeks, I did something simple, something most people don't even think about." He looked Steve directly in the eyes. "I stood up." The words landed with an impact that didn't need music or applause, just a man saying he stood up like it was a miracle. "Not because I felt strong," Keanu said, "but because I felt seen. And being seen, it gives you enough strength to move, just enough. And that was all I needed." Steve's face twisted as he tried to hold himself together, but a tear slid down his cheek anyway. He didn't even bother hiding it. The room didn't judge him. The room didn't laugh. The room honored him with silence. "I had no idea," Steve said finally, his voice breaking. "I swear to you I didn't know." Keanu nodded. "That's the point," he said softly. "You weren't trying to save anyone. You were just being honest, and honesty saves people because it tells them they're not alone." The moment could have ended there. It could have been a powerful confession, a tearful response, applause, a commercial break. That's how television usually works: emotion, release, reset. But this wasn't following the rules of television, because Keanu's eyes held something else now, something unfinished. The story wasn't complete, and Steve could feel it, like a door still half open and wind coming through. Keanu inhaled carefully. "But there's more," he said, and the audience leaned in without moving. "Because that clip didn't just help me survive that night, it changed what I did next." Steve blinked, his throat tight. "What do you mean?" Keanu's voice grew quieter, but the intensity sharpened. "The next morning I didn't wake up happy," he said. "I woke up heavy, but I woke up, and instead of staying in bed, I went outside. I walked. No destination, no plan, just movement. And while I walked, I kept hearing your voice in my head. God doesn't waste pain." He looked down briefly, then back up. "And I realized if pain isn't wasted, then maybe I had been wasting mine by carrying it alone." Steve nodded slowly, his hands clasped together now like he was holding himself in place. Keanu continued. "That day, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called someone, not to talk about work, not to pretend I was fine. I called and I told the truth. And it wasn't pretty, it was messy, but it was real." His eyes shimmered. "And that call was the beginning of me coming back to life, not all at once, but step by step." Steve leaned forward again, voice raw. "You're saying you started reaching out because of that message?" Keanu nodded. "Yes," he said, "and because of you?" Steve shook his head, overwhelmed, almost embarrassed by the weight of the compliment. "Man, I'm just," he began, but Keanu gently cut him off. "No," he said, "you're not just anything." He glanced at the crucifix again. "You carry something, Steve, and you carry it like you don't even realize it." The audience's emotion was now visible, people pressing fingers to lips, wiping eyes, holding hands. And Steve, who had always been the one guiding conversations, now felt like he was being guided somewhere deeper than he expected. He swallowed hard. "Keanu," he said, voice trembling, "why tell me this now?" Keanu's answer came with a calm certainty that made Steve's breath catch. "Because tonight," Keanu said, "I'm not here by accident." Steve's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" Keanu took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with purpose. "That night," he said, "after I watched your clip, I made a promise, not to the internet, not to fans, to God." Steve froze, the room froze, Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "I said, if you get me through this, if you pull me back from that edge, I will do something with my life that points back to you. I will stop hiding. I will stop pretending. I will stop acting like pain is something to be ashamed of." He leaned in slightly. "And I also said something else." Steve's voice was barely there. "What?" Keanu's jaw tightened for a brief second, and his eyes glistened as he spoke. "I said, one day, if I ever meet the man whose words helped me stand up, I will tell him. I will look him in the eyes and make sure he knows what his faith did." Steve's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. His hand covered his chest again, not for the audience, because he couldn't hold his heart any other way. Keanu sat back, letting the promise settle into the air. And then he said it, quietly, firmly, like it was the true reason he had come. "Steve," Keanu whispered, "I kept that promise, and I'm keeping it right now." The studio was so silent you could almost hear breathing echo off the walls. Steve's eyes overflowed, and he didn't fight it anymore. He wiped his cheeks slowly and looked at Keanu with the kind of gratitude that doesn't belong to celebrities, it belongs to survivors. "Man," Steve said, voice cracking open, "you don't know what you just did to me." Keanu shook his head gently, a small smile touched with sadness. "I think I do," he said, "because I know what you did to me." Steve leaned back, swallowing hard, and the host in him was gone now, replaced by the man. "I've had nights," Steve admitted, voice shaking, "where I questioned everything, where I asked God, why you got me out here doing this, why me?" Keanu nodded as if he expected that confession. "Then you already understand," Keanu said softly, "because that question, why me, is the same question people ask when they're carrying purpose they don't feel ready for." And then Keanu's face shifted again, like the next words weren't just memory but mission. He leaned forward, voice low, eyes locked on Steve. "There's one more thing," he said, "and when I tell you, I need you to hear it not as a compliment but as a calling." Steve's breath trembled. "Okay," he whispered. Keanu's voice was calm, but the weight behind it made the room feel smaller, more intimate. "That crucifix you wear," Keanu said, "it's not just jewelry, it's a signal, and tonight, I think it's pointing at something bigger than you realize." Steve stared at him, tears still shining. "What are you saying?" Keanu didn't rush. He let the silence hold them. "I'm saying," Keanu whispered, "that you've been wondering if what you do matters, and I'm here to tell you it matters more than you know, but you're about to be asked to carry it in a bigger way." Steve's eyes widened, fear and wonder mixing together. "Asked by who?" he whispered. Keanu's answer came slowly, gently, but it struck like lightning. "By God." And the moment the word left his mouth, Steve's hand tightened around the crucifix, as if his spirit recognized something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. The audience leaned in, and Steve's voice was barely audible. "What does that even mean?" Keanu's eyes held his. "It means," he said, "the next season of your life is going to require more than comedy, and I think you already feel it, that restlessness, that tug, that holy discomfort." Steve sat frozen, shaking slightly, overwhelmed by how accurately those words described what he had been hiding even from himself. And Keanu leaned in one last time, voice almost a whisper. "But before I tell you what that looks like," he said, "I need to tell you the real reason I came on this show tonight, and it's not for an interview." Steve stared at him, breath caught in his chest. Keanu's voice dropped. "It's because I brought something with me," he said, "and it has your name on it." And Steve Harvey, who had faced crowds, cameras, and fame, looked suddenly like a man bracing for a truth that would change everything. The air on the set felt heavier now, not in a suffocating way, but in the way a room feels when something sacred has entered it. Steve Harvey sat with his hands clasped together, knuckles faintly white, his breathing slower, deeper, as if he were unconsciously preparing himself for something that had not yet been spoken. Across from him, Keanu Reeves looked calm, but there was a gravity in his eyes that told a deeper story. When he said he had brought something with him and that it had Steve's name on it, it didn't sound metaphorical. It sounded like someone opening a door that had been locked for years. Steve let out a soft, unsteady breath. "What did you bring?" he asked. His voice carried curiosity, yes, but also something else, an almost childlike vulnerability, the sound of a man who sensed that what was coming would not flatter him but would change him. Keanu didn't reach into a pocket. He didn't pull out an envelope or a gift bag. He didn't reveal an object at all. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair as if creating the space necessary for something invisible to exist between them. "I brought words," he said quietly. "Not my words, yours," Steve blinked. "Mine," Keanu nodded. "From that night, from that clip, from the moment you didn't even know you were talking to me." The audience stirred almost imperceptibly, like a field of wheat moved by a soft wind. Steve's brow furrowed, trying to remember, trying to place the moment Keanu was referring to among the many late nights, speeches, and improvised reflections he had shared over the years. Keanu's voice deepened, not louder but steadier, as if he were anchoring himself to something older than memory. "I remember exactly how you were standing," he said, Your shoulders were slightly forward. Your eyes weren't scanning the crowd like they usually do when you're telling jokes. They were fixed, focused. You weren't performing, you were confessing. Steve's lips parted slightly, and he shook his head in quiet disbelief. That night, Keanu continued, you talked about storms. You said storms don't come to destroy us, they come to reveal what we're built on. And I remember thinking, this man isn't talking about weather, he's talking about life. Steve leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his face open, unguarded. I didn't even plan that message, he said softly. I was tired, the show had ended, the crew was packing up, I felt something in me that wouldn't let me go home yet. Keanu nodded gently. That's how it felt watching you, he replied. Like something in you wouldn't let you stay silent. The two men held each other's gaze, the space between them charged with recognition. Keanu went on, you said something that cut through everything else. You said, God doesn't always calm the storm. Sometimes he lets the storm rage so you can discover the strength you didn't know you had. Steve's eyes glistened. He remembered it now. He remembered the ache in his chest that night, the sense that if he didn't speak, something in him would fracture. When you said that, Keanu added, I felt like you were describing exactly what was happening inside me. I wasn't asking for the storm to stop anymore. I just wanted to know if I could survive it. The audience sat suspended in the moment, the kind of stillness that only forms when people recognize their own hidden chapters in someone else's story. Keanu's voice softened. Then you touched the crucifix on your chest, he said. Just like you're doing now, not for the crowd, not for emphasis, it was instinct. And you said, God doesn't waste pain, he recycles it into purpose. Steve closed his eyes briefly, the words returning to him like a familiar hymn. I remember thinking, Keanu continued, if that's true, then maybe my pain hasn't been meaningless. Maybe it hasn't been punishment. Maybe it's been preparation. Steve inhaled slowly, deeply, the breath of a man absorbing something that was no longer just a compliment, but a reflection. I never knew anyone was holding on to those words like that, he said. Keanu smiled faintly, a sad, grateful curve of the lips. That's the thing about words spoken from the heart, he replied. You never know where they land. You never know who carries them into the darkest rooms of their life. He paused, then added, I carried yours. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of connection, of the invisible threads that bind strangers who never meant to meet. Steve wiped his cheeks slowly, not hurriedly, not with embarrassment, but with acceptance. You said you brought something for me? He murmured. You mean this? Keanu shook his head gently. This is only part of it, he said, because there was one line you said that night that I've never been able to shake, not because it was poetic, but because it felt like a responsibility. Steve's chest tightened. What line? He asked. Keanu's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. You said sometimes you think you're the one who needs saving, but all along God has positioned you to be the one who saves. Steve's breath caught. The audience reacted almost inaudibly, a collective intake of air. When you said that, Keanu continued, I felt something settle inside me, something heavy but not painful, something that said, if I'm still here, then I'm not just meant to survive. I'm meant to give something back. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his voice firm but gentle. Those words didn't just keep me alive, Steve, they changed the way I live. Steve's eyes widened slightly. How? He asked. Keanu's answer came slowly, carefully. I stopped seeing my story as something to hide, he said. I stopped pretending the losses hadn't shaped me. I started talking to people differently, listening differently, showing up differently, because I realized, if pain can be recycled into purpose, then every interaction is an opportunity to pass on what someone once passed to me. Steve nodded, deeply moved. You know, he said quietly, I've always believed that when God takes you through something, he doesn't do it just for you. He does it so you can reach somebody else. Keanu smiled softly. That belief, he said, is what I carried into the world after that night. He glanced briefly toward the audience. I started paying closer attention, not to crowds, to individuals, to the person who looks invisible, to the one who thinks no one notices them. Because I know what it's like to sit in a room full of people and feel completely alone. The audience shifted, many nodding unconsciously, as if he had spoken a truth they didn't know how to articulate. Keanu turned back to Steve. And the more I lived that way, he continued, the more I realized something else. That night didn't just change me, it changed how I saw you. Steve raised an eyebrow slightly. How so? Keanu hesitated, as if weighing the words not for drama, but for accuracy. I stopped seeing you as a host, he said, or even as a motivator. I started seeing you as something closer to a shepherd. Steve let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. Man, don't put that on me, he murmured. Keanu shook his head gently. I'm not putting anything on you, he replied. I'm naming what was already there. Steve leaned back, his hand once again finding the crucifix. I've always felt this pull, he admitted, his voice low, intimate. Like there's something more I'm supposed to be doing, something beyond making people laugh, but every time I get close to it, I talk myself out of it. I tell myself I'm not qualified, not disciplined enough, not holy enough. Keanu listened without interrupting, his expression open, attentive. And yet, Steve went on, every time I try to walk away from speaking about faith, from purpose, from God, something pulls me back. Keanu nodded slowly. You know why? He asked. Steve looked at him. Because the things we try hardest to avoid are usually the things we're called to carry. The words landed softly, but they landed deep. Steve's eyes closed briefly, as if in surrender to a truth he had felt but never spoken aloud. Keanu inhaled. That's why I said I brought something with me tonight, he continued. Because I didn't just bring your words back to you, I brought back what they awakened. Steve's voice trembled. And what's that? Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Your assignment. The word hung in the air, heavier than any compliment. Steve opened his eyes. Assignment, Keanu nodded. Yes, he said, because when you spoke that night, you weren't just encouraging, you were commissioning, even if you didn't know it. You were telling people that survival is not the end of the story, that being saved is not the same as being sent. Steve stared at him, his breathing shallow, his heart visibly pounding beneath his suit. Keanu leaned in, his voice lowering, not to create drama, but to honor the seriousness of what he was about to say. Steve, he said, I believe that God has been using your voice to prepare people, to keep them alive long enough to find their way, but I also believe he's preparing you. Steve swallowed hard. Preparing me for what? He asked. Keanu paused, and in that pause there was no television, no audience, no celebrity. There were just two men and a truth. For a season, Keanu said slowly, where your platform becomes less about entertainment and more about testimony. Steve's eyes filled again. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he whispered. Keanu's response was immediate, gentle, unwavering. No one ever is, he said. Readiness doesn't come before calling, it comes from answering it. Steve leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees again, head slightly bowed. You know what scares me? He admitted. Keanu waited. That if I really step into that, I won't be able to hide anymore. Not behind jokes, not behind shows, not behind success. Keanu nodded. That's exactly why it matters, he said. Because the world doesn't need another polished voice, it needs an honest one. The audience felt it. You could see it in the way they sat straighter, in the way tears were wiped without shame. This was no longer a celebrity interview. It was a mirror. Keanu's voice softened once more. The night you spoke those words, he said, you gave me permission to live. Tonight I'm giving them back to you so you remember what kind of power God placed in your mouth. Steve's head lifted slowly. Power? He asked. Keanu nodded. The power to pull people back from the edge without ever knowing their names, he said. The power to turn pain into permission, the power to speak life. Steve exhaled shakily. Man, he said, I feel like you're reading my mail. Keanu smiled faintly. I think, he replied, we're both reading the same letter. Steve sat back, absorbing everything, his eyes fixed on Keanu, searching, processing, surrendering. You said there was something else, Steve finally whispered. Something you brought with you. Keanu's expression grew more serious but not heavy, purposeful. Yes, he said. Because everything I've told you so far explains why I'm grateful, but what I'm about to tell you explains why I'm here. Steve's breath caught. I'm listening. Keanu inhaled slowly. That night, he said, after I stood up, after I called someone, after I started finding my way back, I asked God a question. Steve leaned in. What question? Keanu's eyes shone. I asked, why did you use him? Steve froze. Keanu's voice dropped. And the answer I felt changed how I see you, and how I see myself, and how I see this moment. Steve whispered, almost afraid of the response. What was the answer? Keanu looked at him steadily. He said, because Steve knows what it is to be broken and still believe. Steve's face crumpled. He covered his mouth briefly, emotion surging up in him too quickly to manage. Keanu let him feel it, let him breathe, let him be human. Then he added softly, and because broken people speak a language unbroken people can't. Steve shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. Keanu, he began. Keanu raised a gentle hand, not to stop him, but to steady the moment. There's one more part, he said, and it's the part I've never said out loud, not to anyone. Steve's eyes lifted, red and open. What is it? He asked. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low, full of reverence. The night after I watched that clip, he said, I wrote something down, a promise, a prayer, a reminder. Steve waited. The audience waited. I wrote, Keanu continued, if I ever meet this man, I will tell him he is not just encouraging people, he is carrying them. Steve's breath shuddered. Keanu looked at him intently. "And tonight," he said, "I've done that, but there's something else I wrote, and that's what I brought with me." Steve's voice was barely a whisper. "What did you write?" Keanu's eyes did not leave his. "I wrote," he said slowly, "that one day I would stand in front of you and tell you that God is about to ask more of you than you expect, because he trusts you with the weight." The words settled like a mantle. Steve sat motionless, heart pounding. "Ask more of me how?" he whispered. Keanu inhaled deeply, as if preparing not to reveal a thought, but to open a door. "I think," he said, "you're about to step into a season where your voice becomes less about laughter and more about healing." Steve's eyes widened, fear and wonder intertwined. "And what makes you think that?" he asked. Keanu's answer was simple, but it struck like thunder. "Because healers are always called by those who have been healed." And Steve Harvey, who had spent his life holding microphones, suddenly felt like one had been placed in his soul. Keanu leaned back slightly, letting the words breathe, then added quietly, "And I didn't come tonight just to thank you." Steve looked at him, breath trembling. "I came," Keanu said, "to remind you who you are before the world tells you who to be." The audience sat suspended between tears and awe. Steve whispered, "And who am I?" Keanu's eyes softened. "You're not just a host," he said, "and you're not just a comedian." He paused. "You're a man carrying a calling." Steve closed his eyes, tears slipping freely now, his hand clutching the crucifix as if it were an anchor. And Keanu leaned in one final time, his voice barely above a breath. "And in the next few minutes," he said, "I'm going to tell you something that will make you understand exactly why." The silence that followed Keanu's words felt unlike any silence Steve Harvey had ever experienced on a stage. It wasn't the pause that comes before applause. It wasn't the space a comedian leaves for laughter to rise. It was something deeper, something that pressed gently against the chest and made breathing feel intentional. Steve sat with his eyes closed, his hand firm against the crucifix beneath his jacket, as if he were holding himself in the moment so he wouldn't drift away from it. Across from him, Keanu Reeves remained still, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he understood that sometimes truth needs room before it can be received. When Steve finally opened his eyes, they were red, but they were also clear. There was no performance left in them, no hosting posture, no practiced warmth. There was only a man standing emotionally barefoot on his own stage. He swallowed and let out a slow breath that sounded like surrender. "You keep saying I'm carrying something," he murmured, his voice thick, intimate. "A calling, a weight, a voice, but what if I've been getting it wrong? What if I've been hiding from it instead of honoring it?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, his presence steady, grounding. "Then that doesn't mean you've failed," he said gently. "It means you've been human." He paused. "And humans don't run from callings because they're weak. They run because callings demand more than talent. They demand transformation." Steve nodded faintly. Those words didn't wound him. They named him. The audience watched, transfixed, not as spectators, but as witnesses. The room felt like it had quietly stepped out of time. Keanu's gaze held Steve's with a calm certainty. "When you spoke that night," he continued, "you weren't speaking like a man who had all the answers. You were speaking like a man who had survived the questions, and there's a difference." Steve exhaled softly, as if something in him had finally been articulated. "I never felt like I fit the picture people have of faith," he admitted. "I didn't grow up with polished prayers. I came from the streets, from struggle, from messing up more than I got it right. And sometimes I feel like maybe God should have chosen someone cleaner." Keanu shook his head slowly. "That's the lie that keeps people quiet," he said, "that only the polished can carry the sacred." He leaned in. "But the sacred has always moved through the scarred." Steve's jaw trembled. "You know what scares me," he whispered, "that if I stop being funny, people won't listen." Keanu's reply came without hesitation. "They already are," he said. "They listen when you're not trying to be funny. They lean in when you're not hiding. That's not because of your timing. That's because of your truth." Steve looked away for a brief second, overwhelmed, then back at Keanu. "You keep talking like you see something in me I don't see in myself." Keanu's eyes softened. "That's usually how callings work," he replied. "They're easier to recognize from the outside because the person carrying them is too close to the weight to measure it." He paused. "But I need to say this to you clearly, not poetically, not emotionally, clearly." Steve held his breath. Keanu's voice was calm, but it carried conviction. "Steve," he said, "I don't believe you were given a microphone to entertain. I believe you were given one to reach." Steve's eyes widened slightly. Keanu continued, and I don't believe you were shaped by pain just to survive it. I believe you were shaped by it so you could translate it. Steve leaned forward unconsciously, like a student leaning toward a teacher, though neither man occupied those roles. Translate it how? Steve asked quietly. Into hope, Keanu answered. Into language people understand, into stories that don't sound like sermons but feel like rescue. The words struck Steve deeply. He pressed his lips together, emotion surging up again. Man, he murmured, you're talking about a responsibility I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry. Keanu nodded. That's what makes it real, he said. If you felt strong enough, it wouldn't be calling, it would be ego. The audience felt it too. You could sense it in the way no one moved, the way people's bodies leaned forward as if proximity alone might allow them to absorb something meant not just for Steve, but for all of them. Keanu took a slow breath. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, and this is the part that took me years to understand. Steve's eyes stayed on him, unblinking. The night your words reached me, Keanu continued, I thought you were the one doing the saving, and in a way you were. But later, something else became clear. He paused. God didn't just use you to keep me alive, he used me to remind you why you speak. Steve's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Keanu's voice softened. I mean, he said, sometimes God sends back the people you've helped so they can tell you who you were when you didn't know anyone was watching. Steve inhaled sharply. The words felt too accurate to dismiss. And sometimes, Keanu added, he sends them back not just to thank you, but to wake you up. Steve's eyes filled again. Wake me up to what? He asked. Keanu leaned forward, his voice now barely above a whisper but stronger than any amplification. To the fact that you've been preaching without a pulpit, he said, ministering without a title, shepherding without calling it that. Steve shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. Man, don't say that word, he murmured. Minister, that's heavy. Keanu nodded. It is, he said, but it's also accurate. Steve let out a small, broken breath. I'm just a man who made a lot of mistakes, he said, who got grace he didn't deserve. Keanu smiled gently. That's not a disqualification, he replied. That's the resume. The studio seemed to lean closer. Steve wiped his eyes again, then let his hands rest on his knees, palms open. You said you had something to tell me that would make me understand, he whispered. Make me understand why I'm here. Keanu nodded. Yes, he said, and this is it. He paused, not for effect, but because what he was about to say mattered. I think you've been asking God what your purpose is, he continued. And I think you've been waiting for him to say it in a way you couldn't miss. Steve didn't deny it, he couldn't. Sometimes, Keanu went on, the answer doesn't come as a voice, it comes as a person. He gestured gently between them. I think I'm here tonight because I'm one of those answers. Steve stared at him. You, he whispered. Keanu nodded. Yes, he said, because you needed to see the face of someone your words reached. You needed to hear what they did. You needed to feel the weight of it so you could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Steve's chest rose and fell, emotion pressing in on him from all sides. So what are you saying? He asked. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. I'm saying, he replied, that your voice has already been used to pull people back from edges you'll never see. And God doesn't give that kind of reach by accident. Steve sat back, stunned. You make it sound like, he began, then stopped, afraid to finish the sentence. Keanu finished it for him. Like you're called to more, he said. Steve closed his eyes again. That terrifies me, he admitted. Keanu nodded. It should, he replied gently. Sacred things are not meant to feel safe, they're meant to feel necessary. The room was thick with emotion now. Steve looked at Keanu, searching. You've been through things, he said softly. Loss, darkness, silence. You didn't come out of that with bitterness. You came out with this clarity. Why? Keanu's expression shifted not into sadness, but into something like reverence. Because when you survive something that almost takes you, he said, you stop living casually. You start listening for purpose. He paused, and purpose kept pointing me back to this moment. Steve shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. All these years, he said, I thought I was just trying to motivate people, make them feel good, help them get through the week. Keanu's voice softened. Sometimes getting through the week is the miracle, he said. Sometimes that's all salvation looks like. Steve let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. Man, you're breaking me down up here, he said. Keanu smiled faintly. I'm not breaking you, he replied. I'm reminding you. Steve looked up. Of what? Keanu's eyes shone. Of who you are when no one is watching. The words struck him. Steve felt something in his chest shift, like a door loosening. And who am I? He asked again, but this time there was less fear in it, more openness. Keanu didn't answer right away. He took a breath, then spoke with a quiet, unshakable certainty. You are a man whose pain gave him permission to speak. You are a man whose survival became someone else's sign. You are a man who walks into rooms carrying laughter and leaves them carrying hope." Steve's head lowered slightly. Tears fell freely now, not because he was overwhelmed, but because something in him had been named. Keanu leaned in closer, his voice soft but unbreakable. "And Steve," he said, "that's what ministers do." The word settled differently this time, not as a title, as a truth. Steve pressed his lips together, nodding slowly, as if he were agreeing not with Keanu, but with something ancient inside himself. "Then what do I do?" he asked. Keanu's answer was simple. "You stop running from the weight," he said, "and you start carrying it on purpose." Steve's eyes lifted. "And how do I know when that starts?" he asked. Keanu's gaze moved gently to the crucifix again. "It already has," he replied. "Every time you spoke when it would have been easier to joke, every time you told the truth when it would have been easier to perform, every time you let your scars speak." Steve sat quietly, absorbing it, his chest heavy but strangely light at the same time. "You said there was something else," he whispered. "Something you still haven't told me." Keanu nodded. "Yes," he said, "because everything I've said so far explains what you've been doing." He paused. "What I'm about to tell you explains what's coming." Steve's breath caught. "What's coming?" Keanu inhaled slowly. "A moment," he said. "Right here, right now, that isn't about me and isn't about this show." Steve's eyes searched his face. "Then what is it about?" Keanu's voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's about whether you're willing," he said, "to step fully into who you already are in front of the world." Steve felt the words before he understood them. "Willing to do what?" he asked. Keanu's eyes were steady. "To let God use this moment," he replied. Steve sat motionless. The audience leaned forward, and something unseen seemed to draw closer. The words "let God use this moment" did not echo. They didn't need to. They sank. They moved inward, past the ears, past the mind, and settled somewhere beneath the chest where Steve Harvey could feel them but not yet define them. For the first time since he had walked onto his own stage, he felt like a guest in a room he didn't control. The lights were still there. The cameras were still there. The audience was still there. But the authority in the space had shifted, quietly, unmistakably, from production to presence. Steve sat very still. His hands rested open on his knees now, palms exposed, as if his body had decided something his thoughts were still catching up to. He looked at Keanu, and for a moment the man across from him didn't look like an actor or a celebrity or even a guest. He looked like a messenger. Not in a mystical sense, not dramatic, not cinematic. In the simplest, oldest sense of the word. Someone who had been entrusted with something that did not belong to him. "What does that even look like?" Steve finally asked. His voice was steady, but only because he was holding it steady. "Letting God use this moment, what are you really saying to me?" Keanu didn't rush. He understood that Steve wasn't asking for instructions. He was asking for permission. Permission to step out of the shape he had worn for decades. Permission to be seen differently. Permission to disappoint expectations in order to honor something deeper. Keanu leaned back slightly, drawing a breath that felt more like prayer than preparation. "I'm saying," he began slowly, "that every time you felt that pull toward speaking about faith, about purpose, about God, and you've tried to soften it with jokes so people wouldn't be uncomfortable, that pull wasn't interruption. It was invitation." Steve's jaw tightened. He nodded faintly because it was true. There had been so many moments, late in shows and interviews and speeches, where something in him wanted to go deeper, but he'd pivoted, lightened, laughed it away, afraid of being labeled, afraid of losing people, afraid of becoming someone audiences didn't tune in for. "I've always worried," Steve admitted quietly, "that if I leaned into that too much, I'd lose what I built." Keanu's reply was immediate but gentle. "Or you might finally build what you were meant for." The words didn't feel like correction. They felt like recognition. Steve exhaled slowly. "You talk like you're certain," he said. Keanu nodded. "Not about outcomes," he replied. "About direction." Steve studied him. "And what makes you so sure this direction is mine?" Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his posture mirroring Steve's from earlier, as if the conversation itself were closing a circle. "Because God always uses the voice people already trust," he said. "He doesn't usually build new ones when there are already hearts listening." Steve's chest rose and fell more deeply now. "And people listen to you," Keanu continued. "Not because you're funny, but because you're familiar, because they feel like you're one of them. Because you don't sound like a sermon, you sound like a survivor." The word landed heavily. Survivor. Steve's eyes lowered. "I didn't always survive well," he murmured. Keanu nodded. No one does, he said. That's why grace exists. Steve leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting upward toward the studio lights, not really seeing them. You know what I've asked God more than anything, he said. Keanu waited. Why he keeps blessing a man who keeps messing up. His voice cracked on the last words. Why he keeps putting me in rooms I don't feel worthy to stand in. Keanu didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a quiet conviction that silenced every restless thought in the room. Because, he said, God doesn't choose people because they're worthy. He chooses them because they're willing. Steve's eyes returned to him. And every time you stood on a stage and told people you didn't have it all together, every time you admitted fear, doubt, pain, failure, you were being willing. Steve shook his head slowly, emotion surging again. You make it sound like I've been doing this on purpose. Keanu smiled faintly. I think your spirit has, he said, even when your mind tried to turn it into something smaller. The audience felt the shift. This wasn't a story about Keanu anymore. It wasn't even about Steve's past. It was about a threshold, a moment where reflection becomes decision. Steve's voice came softer. You said earlier God chooses the unlikely, he said. Keanu nodded. He always has, he replied. The shepherd, not the king, the fisherman, not the scholar, the stutterer, not the speaker, he paused, and the comedian, not the cleric. Steve let out a small, broken laugh, then covered his mouth as emotion rose too fast to manage. Man, he whispered, why would he choose me? Keanu didn't hesitate. Because you know what it is to be laughed at and still love, he said. Because you know what it is to fail publicly and still stand. Because you know what it is to walk through doors you didn't build and not forget where you came from. His voice softened. And because you know how to speak to people who think their story disqualifies them. Steve's head bowed slightly. His hands came together again, fingers interlaced. I've always felt like my life didn't make sense, he said. The ups, the downs, the losses, the turnarounds, it felt random. Keanu shook his head gently. It wasn't random, he said. It was language. You were learning the dialect of brokenness so you could speak to it. The words pierced. Steve felt them settle somewhere deep. So what are you really asking me to do right now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu held his gaze. I'm asking you, he said, to stop treating your faith like a private hobby and start honoring it like a public responsibility. Steve's breath caught. Not to preach, Keanu added quickly. Not to become something you're not, but to stop apologizing for who you are when God shows up in you. Steve leaned back stunned. That's a big step, he murmured. Keanu nodded. That's why it feels heavy, he said. Light things don't need courage. The studio remained silent, but the silence was alive now. Steve could feel thousands of people breathing with him, not watching but walking. You said God might ask more of me than I expect, Steve said. What if I don't know how to give it? Keanu's reply was gentle, unwavering. Then you'll learn the way everyone else does, he said, by giving what you have. Steve looked at him. And what do I have? Keanu smiled. A voice people trust, he said. A story people recognize, and a God who clearly isn't done with you. Steve let out a slow, shaking breath. You know what scares me the most? He asked. Keanu waited. That if I really step into this, I won't be able to go back. Keanu nodded. You won't, he said softly, but you also won't want to. Steve stared at him, emotion swelling again. You really believe God chose me, he said. Keanu's eyes shone. I believe God has been using you, he replied. Long before you were ready to admit he chose you. Steve closed his eyes again. A tear slipped down unrestrained. Then why did he send you? He whispered. Keanu's answer was quiet. To say out loud what your spirit has been whispering for years. Steve opened his eyes. And what's that? He asked. Keanu leaned forward, his voice low, steady, full of reverence. That you were never meant to just host conversations, he said. You were meant to open them, that you were never meant to just make people laugh, he continued. You were meant to make them breathe again, that you were never meant to just survive your pain. He paused. You were meant to translate it. Steve's breath trembled. Translate it into what? Keanu's answer came without drama. Into hope. The words settled over the stage like a blanket. Steve sat back overwhelmed. He looked at the audience, then back at Keanu. I don't know if I can do this perfectly, he said. Keanu smiled gently. Perfectly is not the requirement, he replied. Honestly is. Steve nodded slowly. Then what happens now? He asked. Keanu's gaze softened, but his voice held purpose. Now, he said, we stop talking about it. Steve's eyebrows lifted slightly. And do what? Keanu glanced briefly at the audience, then back to Steve. Now, he said quietly, you let the people see the part of you that usually only talks to God. Steve's breath caught. You mean, he began. I mean, Keanu finished gently, this moment doesn't need another story, it needs a response. Steve sat very still. His heart pounded. He knew what Keanu was inviting. He also knew he could refuse. He could smile, thank him, wrap the segment, go to commercial. He could protect himself. He had done that his whole career. But something in him had already moved. What kind of response? Steve asked softly, though he already knew. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He watched Steve, really watched him, as if waiting for something to rise from within him rather than being given from outside. Then he said, the kind you usually save for when the cameras are off. Steve's eyes filled again. His hands tightened together. The audience felt the weight of it, the edge of something unseen but imminent. You're asking me to, Steve started. To speak, Keanu said gently. Not as a host, not as a comedian, but as a man standing where God met him. Steve sat frozen, heart racing, tears shimmering. He looked at Keanu, then slowly out at the audience. Thousands of faces, thousands of stories, thousands of unseen nights. He swallowed. And if I do, he whispered. Keanu's answer was simple. Then the moment becomes more than television. Steve closed his eyes. And for the first time on his own stage, he didn't feel like he was about to perform. He felt like he was about to answer. Harvey did not move right away. The studio, filled with hundreds of people and millions more beyond the cameras, seemed to shrink into something intimate, like a living room lit by a single lamp. His eyes were closed, but his face was awake, muscles shifting subtly as if something inside him were finding its way forward. The applause that usually followed emotional television never came because no one dared interrupt what was unfolding. This was not a beat in a show. It was a breath in a life. When Steve finally opened his eyes, there was no trace of the host left in them. No timing, no performance, no polish, only presence. He inhaled slowly, deeply, the kind of breath a person takes before stepping into cold water, not knowing how it will feel but knowing it must be done. His hands, which had been clenched together, separated and rested open on his knees again, palms up, like a quiet, unconscious gesture of surrender. He looked at Keanu first, and in his gaze there was gratitude, humility, and something new, a readiness he had never felt on this stage before. Then Steve turned to the audience. He didn't stand, he didn't gesture, he didn't smile. He simply faced them as a man faces a mirror. I've walked onto this stage thousands of times, he began, his voice low, steady, carrying without effort. And every time I knew what I was supposed to do, I knew how to move, how to talk, how to lift the mood, how to guide the room. He paused, swallowing. Tonight, I don't. A ripple moved through the crowd, not noise, but recognition. Steve continued, because tonight I'm not standing here with answers, I'm standing here with something else. He placed his hand gently over his chest, over the crucifix. I'm standing here with gratitude, with memory, with truth. He looked down briefly, gathering himself, then back up. I've spent a lot of my life running from quiet, he admitted, because in quiet you hear things about yourself, about God, about what you've been avoiding. A soft, almost broken smile touched his lips. And I've been really good at staying busy. A few people in the audience nodded, tears already tracing down their cheeks. Steve's voice thickened slightly. I made a career out of making noise, good noise, happy noise, but noise all the same. He exhaled. And tonight, sitting here listening to a man tell me that something I said in passing reached him when he was fighting to stay, I realized something. He paused, eyes glistening. I realized that God was talking to me in the very places I thought I was just talking to y'all. The words seemed to move through the room like a current. Steve went on, I thought I was motivating, I thought I was entertaining, I thought I was helping people get through a bad day. And maybe I was, but I never let myself believe that God might have been doing more than that through me. His voice trembled, but he didn't pull away from it. I've always told people God can use your mess, he said, but I never fully accepted that he might be using mine. Steve looked back at Keanu for a moment, and there was something like awe in his eyes. This man came on this stage tonight thinking he was coming to tell a story, Steve said softly, but what he really did was hand me back my own. Keanu remained still, eyes gentle, his presence unintrusive, like someone who had delivered a letter and was now waiting quietly while it was read. Steve turned forward again. So if I'm going to let God use this moment, he continued, then I can't dress it up, I can't make it pretty, I can't make it funny, I can only make it honest. The room leaned in without moving. I don't have a sermon, Steve said. I don't have a speech, I have a life, and that life has been full of wins and losses, faith and fear, obedience and running. He shook his head faintly. And tonight I feel like God finally caught up to me in my own house. A soft, emotional sound passed through the crowd. Steve closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. So I'm not going to talk to you, he said. I'm going to talk with God, and if you want to be part of it, you're welcome. No one moved. Steve bowed his head slightly, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but naturally, the way people do when they stop performing and start meaning. His voice when he spoke again was quieter, but somehow carried further. God, I don't even know how to start this, he said, because tonight you took the words I forgot I said, and you brought them back to me through another man's life. He paused, emotion swelling. You showed me that nothing spoken from you ever falls to the ground, it always lands somewhere. His breathing deepened. So first, thank you. Thank you for keeping him alive. Thank you for keeping me unaware long enough that when I found out, I'd understand it wasn't me. It was you. Tears slipped down his face freely now, unashamed. Thank you for my pain, he said softly. Not because it felt good, but because it taught me how to feel. Thank you for my mistakes because they kept me human. Thank you for my success because it gave you a microphone. The room was utterly still. Even the cameras seemed to retreat into reverence. And God, Steve continued, his voice thick with surrender, if you've been using my voice in ways I didn't know, then tonight, I'm telling you something I haven't said clearly enough. He took a breath. You can keep using it. A soft wave of emotion moved through the audience. I don't know what that looks like, Steve went on. I don't know where it leads, I don't know who it reaches. He shook his head slightly. But I know you don't waste pain, and I know you don't lie to hearts that are listening. He placed his hand more firmly over his chest. So if there's more you want from me, I'm here. If there's deeper you want me to go, I'll go. If there's someone you want me to speak for, I'll speak. Steve lifted his head slowly. His eyes met the audience again, full, open, unguarded. And God, for everyone watching in this room or somewhere I'll never see, who is sitting in their own quiet tonight wondering if their life still matters. His voice softened. Please let them know, if they're still breathing, you're still speaking. The last words landed gently, but they landed deep. Steve inhaled, then exhaled, the breath of a man who had laid something down. When he opened his eyes fully, he found Keanu standing. Not dramatically, not abruptly, just rising as if something in him knew it was time. Keanu stepped forward and Steve stood too, their movements unplanned but perfectly aligned. They faced each other for a moment without speaking, two men bound not by fame, but by something far older and far stronger. Keanu opened his arms first, not as an actor, not as a guest, but as a brother. Steve stepped into them without hesitation. They embraced, and it was not the kind of hug meant for cameras. It was the kind meant for survival. Steve's shoulders shook once, then steadied. Keanu's hand rested firmly between his shoulder blades, grounding, grateful still. The audience rose slowly to their feet, not in applause, but in instinct. People stood the way people stand in churches, in hospitals, in moments that don't belong to entertainment. Some wiped their eyes. Some held their hands together. Some simply stood very still. When the two men finally separated, Steve remained facing Keanu, his hands resting lightly on his arms, his eyes searching his face. You didn't just tell me what my words did for you, Steve said quietly. You showed me what God did with them. Keanu shook his head gently. You showed me first, he replied. I just brought the mirror. Steve nodded slowly, emotion still moving through him like a tide. He turned back to the audience one last time. I don't know what tonight was for you, he said, but I know what it was for me. He touched his chest again. It was a reminder that God is closer than we think, and louder than we expect, and kinder than we ever deserve. Steve looked at Keanu once more, then back at the crowd. And if a conversation on a stage can reach a man in a dark room years ago, then maybe this moment can reach someone tonight. The studio lights felt softer now, warmer. Steve let out a breath and gave a small, sincere nod. Thank you, he said, not to the audience, not to the cameras, but to the air itself. And somewhere beyond the stage, beyond the show, beyond the noise, The world felt it. Not as a viral clip, not as celebrity news, but as something rarer. A moment where two lives crossed, and faith stepped into the light. And